Welcome. You've provided us with a collection of sources that revolve around what is really one of the most tragic and highly publicized criminal cases in Texas history.
It certainly is.
We're talking about the 2002 murder of David Lynn Harris. So our mission today is to thoroughly examine the documentation available. We'll look closely at the specific details, the alleged motivations, and of course the highly contentious legal arguments presented in these materials.
And we have to approach this with the seriousness it deserves. We recognize the profound tragedy suffered by David Lynn Harris, his family, and everyone touched by this.
Absolutely. Our focus is on the facts.
It is. It's essential that we maintain a highly analytical and, factual lens here. The sources lay out the precise details of a high-profile criminal case, but at its core, this is a story of personal betrayal that ended in extreme public violence.
So we're focusing on the verifiable facts around the life and death of David Lynn Harris, an orthodontist, and the subsequent conviction of his wife, Clara Harris, who's a dentist.
Exactly. We'll trace the timeline, dissect the points of legal contention that made this trial such a national fixation.
Let's start with the central figures then, and their status before this all happened. The sources detail David Lynn Harris and Clara Harris as a strikingly successful couple.
Very much so. This wasn't just one successful practice.
No, they owned a whole chain of dental offices. This placed them firmly within the affluent strata of Friendswood, Texas. They really cultivated this public image of success and stability.
And that professional and financial prosperity is such a key piece of the context here. It really heightens the shock factor when such extreme violence erupts from that kind of environment.
I agree.
They had achieved what so many would consider the American dream, a lucrative business they built together, a beautiful home, a family. And that perceived stability made the eventual act of violence just so jarring to the public. It suggested that even that level of success can't insulate a relationship from, catastrophic failure.
So the core incident that we are scrutinizing, it occurred on the night of July 24, 2002. The setting was the parking lot of the Nassau Bay Hilton Hotel near Houston. And the sources, they summarized the event with just brutal clarity. Clara Harris confronted her husband over his extramarital affair.
And then in just a span of moments, she struck and ran over him with her large Mercedes-Benz sedan.
The injuries led to his immediate death at the scene.
And that act, the killing of a spouse by a spouse, has a specific classification. It's called mariticide.
Right.
And while Clara Harris was charged with murder, the resulting conviction contained a really critical finding from the jury, which was sudden passion.
We have to address that legal nuance right away.
We do, because it fundamentally dictates the outcome. The sources confirm this legal distinction was the massive point of contention throughout the trial, specifically because it caps the potential penalty. It prevents a life sentence, even with a murder conviction.
That distinction, premeditated murder versus murder committed in the heat of passion, that's what makes this such a complex legal analysis.
It is.
So our analysis has to systematically trace the facts. We'll start with the foundation, the success David Lynn Harris had achieved, then move through the betrayal, the filmed crime scene, and finally, the long legal process that concluded with Clara Harris's final release from parole.
Let's begin at the beginning, then.
To really understand the collapse, we have to start with the foundation of the marriage. The sources note that David Harris and Clara who had immigrated from Colombia, married on a highly symbolic day.
Valentine's Day, February 14th, 1992.
And as you mentioned in the introduction, that marriage occurred at the Nassau Bay Hilton.
Yes, the very same hotel. The place where they celebrated the start of their life together tragically became the site where that life was violently ended a decade later. This detail, the grim irony of a location, was one of the many elements that just amplified the media interest in the case.
Their family life centered around 3 children. They had twin sons, Brian and Bradley, who were born in 1998. And crucially, David also had a teenage daughter from a previous marriage.
Lindsay. And she lived with the couple.
That's right. And Clara Harris wasn't just David's partner in life. She was his partner in business.
A very successful dentist herself, managing their thriving chain of offices. The sources also mention she had a minor public profile, having previously been named Mrs. Columbia Houston.
That detail seems more than just trivia.
I think it is. It reinforces the idea that she was a woman who was highly invested in maintaining a public image of success, of elegance, of, control.
So when that image and her marriage began to shatter,
the reaction was explosive.
That public identity likely intensified the pain of the personal betrayal David Harris inflicted. The sources confirm that during the marriage, David began an extramarital affair.
And the sources identify the other woman as Gail Bridges, who had been David's former receptionist.
The professional connection there, with the couple's shared business, adds another layer of complexity to the betrayal.
It does. It struck at the core of their professional partnership as well as their personal one. It wasn't just an outside affair. It was connected to their life's work.
As is often the case, Clara Harris began to suspect infidelity. Her response, however, it moved beyond just an emotional confrontation.
It moved into calculated action. She hired a private detective agency to monitor David's movements and gather conclusive evidence.
This decision is pivotal. You really can't overstate its importance.
No, you can't. By hiring those private investigators, Clara Harris transformed what could have been a private divorce proceeding into a documented, auditable timeline for the state.
She was effectively ensuring that whatever happened next, there would be evidence collected by third parties.
She was, in effect, hiring witnesses against herself for what was about to unfold.
And that calculated move proved to be the trigger for the tragedy. On the day of the murder, July 24, 2002, the detective agency contacted Clara Harris.
And they provided the precise, crushing notification. David Harris was at the Nassau Bay Hilton, their wedding site, with his mistress, Gail Bridges.
That combination, the location, the confirmation of her worst fears.
And the fact that she was explicitly informed by a professional third party, it all just set the stage for an immediate catastrophic reaction.
And focusing on that setup, the use of a surveillance team means this private marital dispute was systematically documented and ultimately filmed.
Precisely. The documentation transformed the nature of the crime and the resulting trial. The surveillance team's footage, which was intended to secure leverage in a divorce, instead became the prosecution's strongest, most objective piece of evidence against her.
It captured the vehicle's movements.
It converted a moment of private rage into a recorded, evidence-backed act of criminal violence. This is a critical legal aspect of the case because that video, even though it was imperfect, provided a prosecution with a timeline and a trajectory that the defense just struggled to overcome.
The moment she got that call confirming David's location, the gears of the legal timeline were set irreversibly into motion, leading directly to the confrontation.
And to the crime scene.
The timeline moved so rapidly to the events that night, July 24, 2002, at the Nassau Bay Hilton. Clara Harris arrived at the hotel, driven by this desire to confront her husband and his mistress.
And the initial confrontation was dramatic and physical, according to the sources. Clara reportedly located David and Gail Bridges inside the hotel lobby.
The sources say she physically attacked Gail Bridges first.
Yes, a display of raw, immediate rage that signaled just how far beyond rational control the situation had already spiraled.
This confrontation then triggered an intervention by the hotel staff.
Right. Employees quickly escorted Clara out of the building and directed her toward her car, the Mercedes-Benz sedan, trying to de-escalate the volatile situation.
It was then, as David Harris and Gail Bridges emerged from the hotel, that the situation metastasized into the fatal act in the parking lot.
The sources confirmed that Clara entered her vehicle, and it was the vehicle itself that became the weapon when she struck down David Harris. The confrontation had moved from a verbal and physical altercation to the use of a machine in a sudden, violent manner.
And here we have to pause on the detail that just changes the emotional gravity of this entire account. David Harris's teenage daughter, Lindsay.
She was sitting in the passenger seat of the Mercedes
as her stepmother struck and ran over her father.
It is an agonizing detail. Lindsay wasn't a passive observer from a distance. She was physically present, trapped inside the vehicle as the crime unfolded.
The psychological burden on a young person witnessing the death of a parent at the hands of another caretaker is just unimaginable.
It is. And her presence meant that the act wasn't just a crime between two spouses. It was witnessed firsthand by a vulnerable family member, and her perspective became central to the legal arguments about intent and warnings.
So now we arrive at that critical legal ambiguity. The accounts of what happened after the initial strike.
This conflict over the number of impacts became the cornerstone of the murder trial debate. It forced the jury to choose between eyewitness testimony and, well, physical limitations.
On one side, you have the eyewitnesses, including David's daughter, Lindsay, and they asserted in their testimony that Clara Harris didn't just strike him once. They claimed she drove over him 3 times.
This claim of repeated action, it strongly implies deliberation. It suggests that even after the initial impact, Clara maintained enough control and intent to manipulate the car to inflict further harm.
If true, This greatly supports the severity of the murder charge. It argues against a momentary single lapse of control.
Absolutely.
But the physical evidence, the forensic record, it offered a different, more limited picture.
It did. The medical examiner's official report stated explicitly that they could only be certain of finding one tire mark on David Harris's body.
So this is where the legal challenge truly begins.
Exactly. How does a jury reconcile eyewitness testimony claiming 3 impacts with forensic evidence that confirms only one definite tire mark? This conflict created a massive legal ambiguity regarding Clara Harris's intent.
The prosecution needed to prove intent, that the act was deliberate or committed with malice.
And if they could definitively prove 3 distinct actions, intent is much clearer. But if the defense could argue for only one impact, it allows for a more credible argument that this was a single tragic loss of control committed in sudden passion.
David Harris was pronounced dead at the scene. Clara Harris was immediately arrested and charged with murder.
And the ensuing legal process had to immediately grapple with these conflicting facts. The number of times the car was driven over him became the foundational dispute. Was it a momentary lapse of control, or was it a deliberate, repeated act intended to inflict maximum harm?
And we circle back to Lindsay's presence. The sources confirm she was a direct witness. Her testimony, her emotional state, would necessarily play a pivotal role in swaying the jury.
A key element here is understanding the dynamic inside that car. The jury had to consider whether, after the initial impact, Clara Harris acted reflexively, or if she consciously ignored the desperate pleas of her stepdaughter to stop the vehicle.
That dynamic really elevates the crime.
It does. It moves it from a simple vehicular homicide to a highly emotionally charged act of deliberate aggression witnessed by a child.
The trial then commenced in February 2003. It quickly became a national media spectacle due to the wealth of the couple and just the dramatic nature of the crime itself.
And the sources confirm the proceedings were marked by high drama and intense legal maneuvering from both sides.
The prosecution's primary goal was to prove the actions transcended sudden passion. They needed to show they were executed with a clear intent to cause serious bodily injury or death.
To do that, they built a case relying heavily on those eyewitness accounts and, of course, the testimony of the victim's own daughter, Lindsay.
Lindsay's testimony against her stepmother was, without a doubt, the most emotionally compelling part of the prosecution's case. She testified claiming she specifically told Clara Harris to stop the vehicle after the initial impact.
And if the jury believed Lindsay, it directly refuted any defense claim that the act was purely accidental or that Clara was so blinded by rage she was unaware of the consequence.
To ignore the desperate plea of a child in the passenger seat would suggest a willful, conscious disregard for safety and life.
It would. It supports the prosecution's argument for deliberate action. And the prosecution reinforced this by setting a critical snippet from a police interview.
Yes, they argued this was more than a mere crime of passion, asserting that Clara wanted to hurt David. They used that short quote from her police interview as proof of a pre-existing malice or intent that went beyond the immediate reactive rage of the moment.
And then, of course, there was the physical evidence gathered by Clara's own surveillance team.
The videotape.
The videotape recorded by her private investigators was introduced, and the sources describe it as especially damning, even with its limitations.
We need to unpack the nature of that video evidence. The sources describe the video as showing the Mercedes circling the parking lot 3 times. This visual evidence of the car's repeated movement, it strongly corroborated the eyewitness accounts of multiple impacts.
Critically, though, the sources note the limitation. David Harris's body itself was not clearly visible in the video footage as the impacts occurred,
Which allowed the defense to argue that while the car moved 3 times, the video didn't definitively prove 3 contacts with the victim.
Exactly. It provided proof of the vehicle's manipulation, but not the contact itself. It confirmed the action, but not necessarily the resulting injury multiple times. This ambiguity provided a crucial foothold for the defense, which they then tried to exploit using physics.
So the defense focused its counter-argument on the technical limitations of the vehicle. They attempted to prove that Clara Harris ran over David Harris only once, which would drastically decrease the implication of malice or deliberation.
They leveraged technical arguments about the physics and the vehicle's mechanics. Through expert testimony from a private consultant, the defense argued the turning radius of that large Mercedes-Benz sedan would have made it physically impossible for Clara to execute the sharp turns necessary to run over David a second or third time.
They were trying to mathematically and geometrically discredit the highly emotional eyewitness testimony.
That was the strategy.
It sounds like a strong technical defense, a purely objective counter to emotional claims. But the sources note a significant setback for them.
A huge setback. The judge ruled the defense's physical recreation of the crime, which was staged by their private consultant, as inadmissible.
And that exclusion is highly significant in any legal proceeding.
Immensely. Often such physical recreations are ruled inadmissible because the defense failed to replicate the conditions of the crime with sufficient accuracy. The lighting, the speed, the precise location of the body, the exact path of the vehicle.
So by excluding that demonstration, the judge forced the jury to rely solely on the theoretical testimony about the turning radius.
Right. It weakened the defense's ability to visually prove their point. They had to rely solely on the consultant's testimony that, theoretically, the mechanics of the car prevented the repeated action.
However, the prosecution was ready for this rebuttal.
They were. Despite acknowledging the defense's turning radius argument as, and I believe the quote was, a good argument, the prosecution launched a powerful, practical rebuttal using photographs taken at the scene immediately after the incident.
They introduced testimony from a police officer who had been present at the scene. And this officer used a police photograph to point out another distinct tire track on the pavement near where the body was.
And the second track was the technical nail in the coffin for the defense's one impact theory. The sources note that the angle of this track went directly to where David Harris's body had been located.
This physical evidence, documented by law enforcement at the time, strongly suggested that the car had indeed made multiple distinct movements.
It was consistent with the eyewitness accounts of multiple impacts, even if the medical examiner could only confirm one definitive mark on the body. The marks on the ground proved the action. The defense could not overcome this proof of maneuvering.
Because of that testimony and the photographic evidence, the sources confirmed the defense was unable to definitively overcome the evidence, suggesting multiple impacts and deliberate vehicular manipulation.
And this illustrates a classic courtroom dynamic. The theoretical, expert-driven, technical argument about physics, the turning radius, it failed when it was countered by objective, on-site physical evidence, that police photo of the second tire track.
The visual proofs of the car's repeated sharp turning movements, corroborated by the surveillance video, allowed the jury to side with the eyewitness accounts.
And it pushed them over the defense's geometrical analysis.
The already dramatic trial then reached its emotional zenith when Clara Harris decided to take the stand in her own defense.
A decision made against the explicit advice of her attorneys. Taking the stand in a murder trial is perhaps the single highest risk an accused person can take.
Why is that?
Well, her attorneys knew that by testifying, she opened herself up to cross-examination. But more importantly, she waived certain legal protections regarding her previous statements to police.
And the consequence was immediate and utterly destructive to her defense.
It was. Her decision allowed previously ruled inadmissible parts of her original police interview to be introduced as evidence.
Specifically, the prosecution was able to introduce a partial audio clip for the jury. The sources state the jury heard Clara Harris's own voice stating that she wanted to hurt her husband.
That quote aligned perfectly with the prosecution's argument that her actions were driven by a pre-existing malice, not just a sudden, blinding panic.
And, crucially, the sources confirmed that the jury did not hear the subsequent portion of that same interview,
where she immediately clarified, "I didn't want to kill him."
Exactly. That part was omitted.
This is a classic example of what's called prejudicial evidence. By hearing only the admission of an intent to injure, the jury's perception of her state of mind was deeply, and perhaps unfairly, skewed towards deliberation.
The omission of that second mitigating phrase.
It essentially eliminated her claim of non-homicidal intent. That single, truncated statement likely solidified the jury's view that she consciously intended to inflict serious, lasting harm.
The pressure and intensity of this revelation were so immense that the sources detail a really remarkable event in the courtroom.
Her attorney collapsed.
Right there in court. The stress caused him to collapse, which necessitated a court recess while he was hospitalized. It just speaks volumes about the dramatic tension and the complete collapse of the defense strategy at that critical moment.
And despite the overwhelming testimony and evidence arrayed against her, Clara Harris maintained her contention.
She consistently claimed that she did not see David Harris when she struck him with her car,
suggesting the act was accidental or, at worst, recklessly negligent rather than intentionally homicidal.
But the visual evidence of the car circling, the photographic evidence of the tracks, and her own partially admitted statement of intent, It was all just too much for the defense to overcome.
It was.
Let's analyze the legal significance of that sudden passion finding the jury eventually returned.
Under Texas law, sudden passion serves as a mitigating factor in the punishment phase of a murder trial. It requires the jury to find that the defendant acted under the immediate influence of a sudden, intense passion arising from an adequate cause.
And what qualifies as an adequate cause?
It means a cause that would commonly produce a degree of emotion that renders the mind incapable of cool reflection. In this case, catching a spouse in the act of adultery was clearly deemed an adequate cause by the jury.
So even though she was convicted of murder, meaning the jury found her actions met the standard for that offense, the finding of sudden passion fundamentally changed the legal consequence.
Exactly. Without the finding of sudden passion, a murder conviction in Texas could carry a sentence ranging from 5 years up to 99 years or life in prison.
But with the jury's finding of sudden passion,
the sentence is capped at 20 years. This distinction is the core legal insight of the entire case. The jury acknowledged the severity of the crime, but also recognized the profound emotional trigger that precipitated it. It reflects a compromise between the state's demand for justice and the mitigating circumstances of extreme betrayal.
And the high stakes of her testimony, her decision to take the stand, was clearly the pivot point.
It was an immense gamble that failed completely. The dramatic consequence of that partial interview being introduced, where the jury only heard "wanted to hurt," likely had a greater impact than any technical argument about physics or forensic reports.
That single edited quote played against the backdrop of the swirling video footage and Lindsay's tearful testimony.
It solidified the guilty verdict and ultimately the 20-year sentence.
Clara Harris was found guilty of murdering David Lynn Harris. The sentencing hearing that followed was marked by a grim, symbolic coincidence. It took place on February 14, 2003.
Valentine's Day, the couple's own wedding anniversary, 11 years to the day after they exchanged vows at the very hotel where the murder took place.
That specific date just intensified the media narrative of a romantic ideal destroyed by violence and betrayal.
It certainly did.
And due to the jury's finding of sudden passion, the maximum sentence permitted was 20 years in prison.
And Clara Harris was sentenced to that maximum term, along with a $10,000 fine.
It's important to stress that while sudden passion provided mitigation, the jury still handed down the most severe punishment possible within that capped range.
It is. This reflects the severity of the act itself, particularly the use of a vehicle as a weapon and the tragic witnessing by David's daughter. The jury utilized the full extent of the law available to them under that mitigating finding.
Clara Harris was subsequently incarcerated at the Mountain View Unit in Gatesville, Texas. Sources give us a few details about her life during confinement.
Yes, she was involved in productive work during her time served, specifically converting school textbooks into Braille for blind students. And while she was in confinement, the legal battles regarding their estate and their children continued outside the prison walls.
Her family life suffered immensely. Her twin sons, who were very young at the time of the murder, were placed in the custody of family friends. The sources note that despite the immense emotional and logistical hurdles, they visited their mother about once a month during her incarceration.
Which highlights the lasting trauma and disruption to the family structure caused by the crime.
After that, the focus then shifted to the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles. For any person serving a lengthy sentence, the parole process is the next major milestone.
It is.
Her first attempt at parole came on April 11, 2013, but it was denied by the Texas Board.
Parole eligibility often begins after a significant portion of the sentence has been served. A denial usually reflects public safety concerns or the nature of the crime itself.
Her second attempt for release followed years later, but that was also denied in September 2016.
Which indicated the board still viewed her as a potential risk, or, more likely, felt the severity of the crime required more time served.
After numerous appeals, she was finally granted parole in November 2017.
And she was subsequently released on May 11, 2018, having served approximately 15 years of her 20-year sentence, factoring in good conduct time. This concluded the period of physical incarceration, but the legal saga wasn't entirely finished yet.
That's right. The source material confirms her status until the definitive close of the legal proceedings. She remained under supervised release parole until February 2023.
At that point, she successfully completed her parole requirements, marking the final conclusion of the legal and penal process documented in these sources.
And the sheer volume of media coverage confirms this case's legacy. It was a perfect storm of sensational details, affluent protagonist, the specific act of driving over the victim with a luxury car, the infidelity, the video documentation, it garnered massive notoriety.
It really did. The sources confirm its lasting impression on popular culture and the true crime genre. A book titled Out of Control was written by Stephen Long about the murder, published in 2004, detailing the events leading up to the tragedy.
It was also a staple of television profiles, which repeatedly analyzed the psychology and circumstances of the crime.
Yes, it was featured on the Oxygen Network series, Snapped in 2004, ABC News' 2020 in 2006, and Investigation Discovery's Deadly Women in 2010.
The consistency of its feature across different networks over a decade confirms its status as a high-profile, enduring true crime subject.
It does.
Furthermore, the case was the basis for a dramatization, the CBS original movie Suburban Madness, starring Elizabeth Pena and Brett Cullen.
And its impact even extended internationally. It served as the inspiration for a chapter in the popular Mexican series Mujeres Asesinas, which translates to Killer Women.
And the chapter title?
The chapter was titled Luz Arrolladora, Luz, Overwhelming. The title itself, Overwhelming, seems to capture the sudden destructive force of the incident.
The sources, by detailing this extensive media coverage, really underscore that this was a national fixation. It was a suburban tragedy that forced the public to confront the realities of betrayal and extreme violence within communities often perceived as insulated from such acts.
And the documentation indicates the legal saga concerning the murder of David Lynn Harris concluded with Clara Harris's final release from parole in February 2023. This thoroughly closes the chapter on the documented facts of the crime, the court process, and the full consequences of the conviction as laid out in the source materials you provided.
This has been a necessary and detailed examination of the sources surrounding the tragic death of David Lynn Harris. We've thoroughly unpacked the sequence of events, starting with the collapse of his successful marriage and that fateful decision by his wife to hire a private investigator.
A decision that essentially guaranteed the violent act would be recorded.
We specifically highlighted the crucial conflicting details that made the trial so difficult for the jury. The video evidence showing the car circling, the eyewitness assertions of 3 impacts versus the medical examiner's official confirmation of only 1 tire mark.
And the powerful rebuttal by the prosecution using the police photo of that second tire track on the pavement. These points illustrate the immense complexity of proving intent in a crime driven by emotion.
We appreciate you providing the materials that allowed for this thorough examination of the circumstances surrounding the murder of David Lynn Harris. It's a case that stands as a stark example of how private betrayal can escalate into public, documented criminal violence.
And how the law must navigate that very fine line between passion and premeditation.
It is.
To conclude, we encourage you to reflect on the unique role that modern technology, specifically that hired private detective's video camera, played in this case. Consider how the documentation of a spontaneous crime of passion fundamentally shifts the narrative in the courtroom. It provides objective visual evidence that can often override emotional testimony.
That's a very important point.
It raises the question, what constitutes objective proof of intent when the act is caught on film but the mind is operating under extreme duress? That is a fundamental tension in modern criminal law.
We hope this comprehensive analysis has provided you with a clear, factual understanding of this tragic event and its legal consequences.
Thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening.